The chance that the buyer of a product has to offer an object that is equally desired by the producer declines as the specialization of products and of human wants increases. So far there is nothing new about the way in which modern differentiation is connected with the predominance of money. Rather, the interrelationship between both cultural values is to be found at their very roots, and the fact that the interactions between the conditions of specialization and the money economy form a historical entity is only the gradual intensification of a synthesis that is inherent to both of them. By means of this connection, the style of life too, in so far as it is dependent on the relationship between objective and subjective culture, is tied up with money transactions. The nature of this relationship is clearly revealed by the fact that money transactions represent the preponderance of objective over subjective mind, as well as the reverse, independent enhancement and autonomous development of the subjective mind. The superior power of the culture of objects over the culture of individuals is the result of the unity and autonomous self-sufficiency that the objective culture has accomplished in modern times. Production, with its technology and its achievements, seems to be a cosmos with definite and, as it were, logical determinations and developments which confront the individual in the same way as fate confronts the instability and irregularity of our will. This formal autonomy, this inner compulsion, which unifies cultural contents into a mirror image of the natural context, can be realized only through money. On the one hand, money functions as the system of articulations in this organism, enabling its elements to be shifted, establishing a relationship of mutual dependence of the elements, and transmitting all impulses through the system. On the other hand, money can be compared to the bloodstream whose continuous circulation permeates all the intricacies of the body's organs and unifies their functions, by feeding them all to an equal extent. Thus money, as an intermediate link between man and thing, enables man to have, as it were, an abstract existence, a freedom from direct concern with things and from a direct relationship to them, without which our inner nature would not have the same chances of development. If modern man can, under favorable circumstances, secure an island of subjectivity, a secret, closed-off sphere of privacy not in the social but in a deeper metaphysical sense for his most personal existence, which to some extent compensates for the religious style of life of former times, then this is due to the fact that money relieves us to an ever-increasing extent of direct contact with things, while at the same time making it infinitely easier for us to dominate them and select from them what we require. These counter-tendencies, once started, may press forward to an ideal of completely pure separation in which all the material contents of life become increasingly objective and impersonal, so that the remainder that cannot be reified becomes all the more personal, all the more the indisputable property of the self. A typical individual instance of this trend is the typewriter. Writing, an external concrete activity but one that still has a typically individual form, can now abandon this form in favor of mechanical uniformity. On the other hand, this has a dual advantage. First, the written page now conveys only its pure content without any support or disturbance from its written form, and second, it avoids revealing the most personal element which is so often true of handwriting, in superficial and unimportant as well as in the most intimate communications. No matter how socialistic all such mechanical contrivances may be, the remaining private property of the intellectual self becomes all the more jealously guarded. Clearly the expulsion of subjective spirituality from everything external is as hostile to the aesthetic ideal of life as it may be favorable to pure introspectiveness. Such a combination may explain why it is that aesthetically minded people despair of the world today, as well as why a slight tension develops in subterranean forms, quite unlike those in the age of Savonarola, between these people and those who are concerned only with inner salvation. In so far as money is the symbol as well as the cause of making everything indifferent and of the externalization of everything that lends itself to such a process, it also becomes the gatekeeper of the most intimate sphere, which can then develop within its own limits. Whether this will lead to personal refinement, distinctiveness and introspection, or whether, on the contrary, the subjugated objects, in view of the ease with which they may be acquired, will gain control over men, depends no longer upon money but upon man himself. Here again the money economy reveals its formal affinity to a socialist society. For what is expected of socialism: release from the individual struggle for survival, secure access to life's necessities and access to the higher economic values, would probably exercise the same differentiating effect, such that a certain sector of society might rise to unprecedented heights of spirituality far removed from earthly concerns, while another sector might plunge into a correspondingly unprecedented practical materialism. Money, by and large, is most influential in those parts of our life whose style is determined by the preponderance of objective over subjective culture. That it may also support its converse places the nature and extent of its historical power in the clearest light. In some respects, money may be compared to language, which also lends itself to the most divergent directions of thought and feeling. Money belongs to those forces whose peculiarity lies in a lack of peculiarity, but which, nonetheless, may color life very differently because their mere formal, functional, and quantitative nature is confronted with qualitatively determined contents and directions of life, and induces them to generate qualitatively new formations. The significance of money for the style of life is not negated but enhanced, not refuted but demonstrated by the fact that it favors both possible relations between the objective and the subjective mind. Alterations in the distance between the self and objects as the manifestation of varying styles of life. We rarely realize to what extent our notions of spiritual processes possess a merely symbolic importance. The basic needs of life have forced us to consider the tangible external world as the first object of our attention. The concepts by which we conceive of an existence perceived outside the observer are therefore valid primarily for its contents and conditions. It is the class of objects in general, and every perception that is to become an object for us has to adjust to its forms. This demand refers to the mind itself, which becomes the object of its own observation. First of all, however, the observation of the you suggests itself as certainly being the most imperative prerequisite for communal life and individual self-assertion. But since we are never able to directly observe the other person's soul, and since all our perceptions are never anything more than our sense impressions, all psychological knowledge is nothing but an interpretation of the processes of consciousness that we perceive in our own mind. We transfer such an interpretation to the other person when confronted by physical impressions of them, even though this transference, focused as it is exclusively on its goal, is unaware of its point of origin. When the mind becomes an object of its own understanding, then this is possible only through images of spatial processes. When we speak of impressions and their relationships, of their elevation into consciousness and their sinking below the threshold of consciousness, of inner propensities and inhibitions, of mood with its elations and depressions, each of these expressions, and countless more, is clearly taken from observations of the external world. We may be quite sure that the laws that govern the life of our mind are of a totally different nature to those that govern an external mechanism, primarily because our mind lacks the clear circumscription and secure recognizability of its individual elements. Yet we unfailingly apprehend these conceptions as a kind of essence that enters into the mechanical relationships of connecting and separating, or rising and falling. We are thus convinced, and experience confirms it, that this interpretation of the mind according to visible processes represents the inner reality of the mind, just as, for the astronomer, the movement of the stars is so successfully represented by his written computations that their outcome represents the picture that is verified by the outcome of the real forces. This relationship is also valid in the opposite direction, namely in the interpretation of external events according to the contents of our inner life. I do not mean to say that the former is nothing but a world of notions, but that, once a relatively external phenomenon confronts a relatively internal one on some kind of epistemological basis, the specific internal phenomena serve to form the external phenomena into a comprehensible image. Thus, it is that the object as a whole is realized by the sum of its qualities that it presents to us only by our lending it the unified form of our ego. In so doing, we basically experience how a wealth of determinations and fates may be attached to a fixed entity. The same may be true, as has often been suggested, of energy and the causality of external objects. We project the feelings of physio-psychic tension, impulses, willful action, onto the objects, and if we place these interpretative categories behind their immediate perceptibility,